Hi everyone. So today's the lecture on evolution. A couple things before we get started. One is that you might notice in the background we're missing a dog, Waffle, who I'm sure is like the star of these videos. Waffle is at the vet currently. She had to go in for a teeth cleaning. And for those of you, like I'm sure some of you know, but for those of you who don't, typically what they do for dogs is they have to put them under anesthesia so they can clean their teeth. And so she's there for that. But also, for those of you who've been watching these videos, you notice her in the background. She's had really bad allergies for like 6 months, and she's never had that before. She's almost 11. But they just weren't getting any better. There was a bunch of medications we tried, and they also had her like on steroids and antibiotics, and there was like her lungs were clear, everything was fine, but she just had all this snot, like clearly her why am I blanking? Her sinuses were clearly like just filled with mucus, and so pretty much every day would just be this. I'd be following her around with tissue, getting all this snot. Anyway, so while she's under, or I should say they did it earlier this morning, while she was under, they took x-rays of her head, and they did like the nasal swab, so hopefully we can get some answers, and she's not going to be, snotty girl anymore. I feel so bad for her, because sometimes if you've heard it on these videos, she's like, it's really stuffed up. So hopefully on the next one she'll be back. And it's just Alice. It's just Alice. Alice is loving the alone time. She and I went to Taco Bell this morning, and she got some hash browns, and she's just been enjoying the alone time with me. Okay. I think she was worried. She's like, wait a minute, what's going on? Because like she went with me to drop off Waffle. She can't stand being by herself, but so she was worried. I think like, where's sister? And I don't know. She'll be very excited to see her. I have to go pick her up in a little bit. Okay, anyway, back to the important stuff. Like, you guys don't, I'm sure, want to know every single detail about my life, but okay. So on to the PowerPoint. So slide 2 of the PowerPoint evolution. So this first slide is a little bit of the review from when we talked about, I think there was a PowerPoint, it was called Anthropology and Science. And at the very end of that PowerPoint, we discussed some terminology, and this is what I'm referencing here. So this term theory. So when we use the term theory in everyday conversation, typically we mean something very different than how we use the term theory in science. So this is just reiterating that science, a scientific theory is something that has been shown to be correct. In fact, it's usually the idea of a theory is that it's not just explaining one or two small incidences, it's encompassing multiple scientific laws and rules to explain an overarching idea or concept. So in science, you want to be at that level, versus like if you use the term theory in everyday conversation, it typically means it's a good guess, maybe even based on some evidence, but it's not even close to being the same thing as the word theory that we use in science. And then just to reiterate again, science must be repeatable, falsifiable, and change with new evidence. These are some of the great things about science being a self-correcting system, and that we're always moving towards objective truth with all of the things built into the scientific process, the scientific method, it being repeatable, falsifiable, and changing with new evidence, peer review, this whole process. Okay, next slide, slide 3. So this is just more repeat of what we had talked about before. It's kind of wordy, but I basically said all this already, that it's not the same thing we use in everyday conversation. Scientific theory is the height of any scientific field. Okay. Let's see. And then slide 4, also a repeat, but just to make it all clear again. We have these terms, they're scientific theory. So like gravitational theory, I'm pointing like you can see. Like gravitational theory, evolutionary theory, cell theory, germ theory. So that's the correct term. But typically when we're talking about like these concepts, like we don't usually go around saying gravitational theory. You might say gravity, and someone would probably understand you mean like the larger concept of gravity, the larger field. And the same thing is true for evolution. We don't go around saying evolutionary. Well, I mean, I do, because like it depends on what level you are in academia, like using one or the other, but saying evolution is perfectly, is absolutely fine. However, because of, and I know I said this to you guys before, but because we have the word theory in everyday conversation, when we use it in a scientific way, like evolutionary theory, often because people don't have that scientific background, especially like even just in general terminology, that they often misunderstand it. And so what we end up hearing are phrases like, well, evolution's just a theory. And it's unique to that one too, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned before, because usually you don't hear people saying, well, gravity's just a theory. But this, if that rule applies to saying that phrase towards evolution, then the same thing would apply to gravity. It just basically, when you hear someone say that, all it really means is that they don't have an understanding of like basic scientific terminology, which is, unfortunate. Okay. Slide 5. So now getting into the main idea of this PowerPoint: evolution, a change in allele frequency in a population over time. And per the meme, it is so simple. This is a simple idea. In fact, I don't know if I showed you guys this already, but I have this tattooed on me: a change in allele frequency in a population over time. So for this class, because it's the cultural class, we're going to be talking about change over time, like culturally, socially, in terms of like language or religion, all these different changes through time. And that's super important to anthropology as a general field, but specific to biological anthropology and biology, and it's going to pertain to this class as well. For biological evolution, there's a very specific definition: a change in allele frequency in a population over time. Now you might be thinking, I'm not sure about those terms. Okay, I know what change is, and I'm pretty sure I know what population is, but what is allele? What about frequency? If you're taking the 102 class with me, we spend a lot more time on this, and even that version is a little simplified because this is not an intro to bio where you'd spend a lot of time talking about these processes. Even for the biological anthropology, we spend a little more time than I'm going to spend with you right now, but even then it's simplified. So this is the even more simplified version. This is just because this is the cultural class. I just want you to have a basic understanding of some of this so we can, implement those ideas throughout the rest of the semester. So if you've taken the 102 with me, or you've taken like an intro to bio, you realize I'm oversimplifying some of these, but this is just for those who aren't familiar with the topics, so you just have a very general understanding. We make sure we're all on the same page with this. Okay. Slide 6, genetics. So in this picture is a what's called a karyotype. Basically, this is the visual representation of the genetics of an individual. So for this individual, if we were in class, I would ask you, like, can anyone guess what species this might be, or is it a male or a female? So it is a human. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes, and it is a male because there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So I would assume most of you probably already know that, like that the sex chromosomes, that female is XX, male is XY. There are, of course, as with everything in nature and life, exceptions to the rule. So there are certain genetic anomalies where you might have like an extra X chromosome or something, but that's obviously not the standard condition, XX and XY. And so sometimes you might also hear them, so it's 23 pairs or 46 single. Hopefully you understand that that's like the same number, and it just depends on during the process, like if we're talking about like mitosis or meiosis, certain parts in that process, they might be paired up or separate, so it's just reference to that, but it's the same number. And if you see right there on the picture that for the pairs of chromosomes, they kind of look similar in the shading. That's supposed to represent like genes, or areas of DNA, and the general shape is also similar. This is important. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because I think I mentioned it in a second, but okay. So next slide, slide 7. Oh, perfect, right here. So like I already said, genes. So if you're looking at those chromosomes, that this is obviously, like I said, a simplified version of this, but the section of DNA is a gene. So like if you go back real quick, go back to slide 6. If you're looking at those different chromosome pairs, like say for example, look at chromosome 3. And you can see it's like, kind of blue, then yellow, then blue, then dark blue, then like kind of a red. There's like a color change. And basically those sections of color are the same on either of those chromosomes, right? Basically what this is indicating is, and for all the chromosomes, is that on either pair, that section of DNA is coding for the same trait, but the information might be different, might be the same. So for, like, just as a very simplified example, imagine we're looking at chromosome 3 at that like kind of red part at the bottom, and we say that's the area for hair color. On one chromosome, it might have information for brown. On the other one, it also might have information for brown, but it might have information for brown and then information for blonde or black or whatever, Most of you, I'm assuming, probably know this. Genetics are much more complicated than that. But sometimes, and I think I'm going to have some of these examples, every once in a while they are pretty simple like that. But just understand, so let's go back real quick to slide 7. So while that section of DNA is, we call that a gene, or like a package of information, that alternative form, whether it's, brown or blonde, or for like eye color, for example, green or blue or brown or black and green or whatever it is, that's called an allele. It's the alternative form. So you might have, for any given trait, you might have 2 alleles that are the same. You might have 2 alleles that are different. And depending on if one of them is dominant or recessive, what you see on you, what we call phenotypically, your phenotype, like the visual thing we see on you, your visual trait, your genetics might indicate that if you have oh my gosh, I got too far ahead of myself. If you have an allele, let's say for brown eyes and one for brown eyes, another one for brown eyes, you're gonna have brown eyes. But say you have one for brown eyes and blue eyes, and the brown, let's say for example, is dominant, you're gonna have brown eyes. But in your genes, you still have genetic information for blue eyes, which is why your offspring might have them. Now, like I said before, eye color is much more complicated than that, but this is just general example so you understand that genes, alleles, sometimes they can be the same, sometimes they can be different, but you will still have that information in your genetics. Okay. Slide 8. Okay, so you might be thinking, why are we getting into some of this basic stuff? I'm talking about reproduction and genes and alleles, and maybe you might be thinking, we're all adults, why is she going over this? We all know this, especially if I started talking to you about like, where do babies come from? Like, it's assumed that you all know this. Like if I ask any of you, tell me in a clinical sense, like what happens? Like, how do we create new humans? You would say, hopefully, you would say, well, there's a male and a female, there are gametes, a sperm and an egg, there's sexual intercourse, half the genetic information for the male, half the genetic information for the female. Then you have a process of gestation where you have like an embryo and then a fetus. Like most of you understand, like I use those words, most of you, I'm assuming, probably know those words, understand in general that process. Like it's not a mystery to you as adults in the world how reproduction works. But this can't always be assumed, and this is the point of this slide right here, slide 8, is that even in, these were screenshotted like a few months ago, and you, trust me, there are many people like living in the U.S. or in other, areas where you would think like they have access to like Western medicine, maybe a decent sex education system. Now, I mean, that's another argument too. You could say, look, okay, as adults we should know this, but the sex education system in the U.S. is like bullshit, and I would probably agree with you that that's definitely true. Hence why we see, so many people who into adulthood probably should know things don't. In fact, as an example, I had a student, this was years ago, thought that, like this was an adult, they were like 18, thought that you couldn't get pregnant the first time you had sex. And so this was just a few years ago. So imagine like I'm hoping none of you are watching this thinking, I thought that too. Like, and if you did, now you've learned that that's not accurate, that you absolutely can. That's the point of, taking a class, learning, no one's gonna make fun of you for learning. And no one's gonna make fun of you for not knowing. Because I'll tell you, like, not related to this topic, but like literally, everyone has their blind spot. So I only learned, I might have given you guys this example before, I don't know. Like I said, I'm sorry sometimes if I like repeat the same thing, because I think, which class did I tell? I don't think I've told you guys this though. I didn't know until just a couple of years ago, like when you're like on your computer keyboard, that like Control A, like, highlights everything, Control C, copy. Like I didn't know all the control, now I'm using them all the time. I didn't know any of that. But then, like, how would I have known? Because no one who knows that was born knowing that. You had to learn. And for other people, they just happened to learn at earlier times in their life. I just never knew. No one ever told me that. I'd never learned that in a class. I didn't learn until a few years ago. So, I mean, people might be thinking, oh my God, she was in her 30s when she learned that, but it happens. And also, something happened more recently, too. I realized I've been saying a word wrong for, like, my whole life. I thought the word was finagle, with an N, finagle, but it's finagle. You might be thinking, I've never even heard of that word. So, like, I don't know. I don't hear a lot of people use it. But, I've been saying it wrong. And a friend said, I was like, wait, am I saying it wrong or are you saying it wrong? And he was like, I think I'm saying it right. And I was like, well, I think I'm saying it right too. So we Googled it. And I'm like, I've been saying it wrong this whole time. So like I said, everyone has their blind spot. There's nothing embarrassing about not knowing stuff. Like no one knows everything, right? And then I learned the correct information and then I implemented it. And, I can change my opinion or the functionality of the word because I learned the correct way. And so there's nothing wrong with being corrected and recognizing that you might be wrong about something or you didn't know. Anyway, back to the point of this is that if you weren't sure about any of that, you were like, wait a minute, I didn't know you could get pregnant the first time, or I didn't realize it was 50% genetic information from the mother, 50% from the father. You're not alone in this. Like this is definitely, if you looked at everyone in the world now, a lot of people wouldn't know that. And historically, most people didn't understand that. Even like if we were saying like even in our own culture, if we went back 100 years, I totally blanked. A lot of people understood that there was a connection between sex and reproduction, but the way we understand it like genetically now is not the way it was understood before. So I just want to make sure we all have that grasp, because this is important when we start talking about evolution, that you understand it's 50%, 50%. And there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's a very generally accurate statement. Okay, so moving on to slide 9. Okay, so do this. Everyone do this. Don't think about it. Just do it. Now look at your hands. You have one thumb that's on top. For me, it's the left. Now do it the other way. Don't just move your thumb. Move all of your fingers. Interlock them the complete opposite way. Does that feel awkward to you? It's because you actually, like it should, if you do it the opposite way. Whether you had initially had left or right on top. You actually have a gene that codes for this behavior. This is called a Mendelian trait. This is what I was saying. There are some times when it is very simple. You have one gene that codes for one trait. It's not, more complex than that. There are a handful. And this is the point of this. So I've got like sunlight coming through this. It's driving me crazy. Okay. The point of this PowerPoint, that there are some traits. So there's a couple of examples. So you can see earlobe attachment. So whether you have attached or unattached earlobes, the cleft chin. So here we have Adele. She's, demonstrating that cleft chin, whether it's the little cleft or sometimes it's like the dimple. It's the same thing. Evangeline Lilly with the widow's peak. So when you see that your hairline comes to a point, which I always think is super cute, there's one gene that codes. So either you have it or you don't. Just like with the cleft chin, either you have it or you don't. And attached earlobes, it's one or the other. And then the other picture is of Darwin's tubercle. So that's that little like nodule of cartilage. Like most people have that little piece of cartilage on their ear. So those are just a few examples of those very simple, what we call Mendelian traits. One gene, one trait. Pretty easy to understand. Okay, so here on slide 10, you can see an example of a Punnett square. And this is what I was talking about before with looking at like dominant versus recessive. So for these individuals, there's an individual like represented on the side and then on the top. Both of these individuals are what is called heterozygous. So they have one, for whatever trait this is, let's just say it's like eye color. They have one dominant and one recessive allele, and then inside the Punnett square is showing what the possibilities for their offspring would be based on the male and the female, based on their genetic information, that they might end up having children with the same exact genes, those who are a different combination, and depending on which one's dominant or which one's recessive in terms of this trait, their children may or may not have a different phenotype, that different like physical expression of that. Okay, slide 11. Mitosis and meiosis. So this, I've put all of this on one slide, and like I said, if you have taken a intro to bio or even the 102 with me, you know that this is much more complex. I really just want you to have there's one or two things I want to point out. So the process of mitosis and meiosis is so much more complex than just what I'm putting here. There are like multiple stages and like sub-stages, and there are so many different things going on. The only thing I really want you to know, and this is the point of this slide, is that there are two processes that your body goes through to make cells. One is to make just your normal body cells for like general growth and repair. So if you like stub your toe, or if you break a bone, or if you're a young child and you're growing, your body's making cells all the time When you're sloughing off skin, your body's going to make new skin cells. Like that's the whole point. Like your body's constantly making cells. That's one process. But there's another process to your body making cells, where it's making very specific types of cells, your sex cells. And so the processes are fairly similar from the beginning to almost the end. But meiosis, this is the one for sexual reproduction, making your sex cells, that one kind of has one extra step. So basically what you end up, and this is what I've put here, in mitosis, the cell begins diploid and ends diploid. Basically what that means is it begins with the full number of chromosomes, for your species, and it ends with that same number. But for meiosis, the cell begins diploid and ends haploid. So it begins with a normal body cell with the full number of chromosomes that you would have like as an individual in your species, but it ends with half of that amount. And then the follow-up question is to why is there only half? And hopefully you understand it's because when you're going to make a new human, female gives half, male gives half. It's because literally their sex cells have half. Now, like I said, it's a little more complex than that, how this process happens. So you as an individual, not every time you contribute an egg or sperm, is it the same half? Like, because there's a whole process behind this happening that it might be, because your genes, you have different alleles and stuff, that it's often going to be a different combination, depending on a few things. But this is still generally accurate. Okay. Slide 12, Mendelian Genetics. So Gregor Mendel, you've probably heard of him. I'm sure most of you probably heard of him like in, I think the first time I was like junior high, you learned about Gregor Mendel and his like pea plants. So he did a lot of experiments. So like before him, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this before. Did I talk about this with you guys? What about Darwin? Okay, I don't know if I'm going to repeat myself, but I want to make sure I tell you if I haven't told you already. Because we'll be talking about Darwin a little bit more, but I'm not sure if I'd mentioned him to this point with you guys. So Darwin wrote, in the 1850s on the origin of species, and his main idea was the idea of natural selection, which we'll get into in just a minute. But it wasn't as if he was the first person to have any idea about the evolutionary process. Like many other scientists for a long time before him had been noticing things, had been formulating ideas. None of them were quite correct, but he had this idea that was different from theirs, and we know now was absolutely correct. But there was a big kind of controversy in the scientific community because many people were like, yes, Darwin, you have it, you figured it all out. And others were like, wait a minute, how do you explain this process? Because of basically Darwin's idea was that certain traits are more beneficial than others given the environment. And if those individuals who have those traits do better in that environment, they're going to be more likely to survive, have offspring who survive, pass on that genetic information. But the critique was always, well, how does that work reproductively? Because at the time, many of them thought traits just were kind of blended, and visually that kind of makes sense because some traits appear to be blended even though we know that's not how genetics work. So I'll give you an example. So height is a really good example. I am 5'10", my mother is 5'4", my father is 5'4", so I'm like right in the middle. Now, if I'm an only child, if I would have had more siblings, some would have been shorter or taller. But it still kind of appears that it's like a blending. And sometimes even in nature, like in plants, you'll see coloring. And that's sometimes, there's a red and a white, and then you get a pink, for example. But of course we know now that it's much more complex than that. The traits just aren't blended. But at the time, a lot of them thought, well, traits, how can it really be beneficial and be passed on and carry on for generations if they just kind of get blended away? And this was kind of one of the main critiques of Darwin's idea. But what we ended up realizing decades later was that Gregor Mendel was literally doing experiments with this at the same time. And it wasn't until decades later that everyone was like, oh, Darwin, oh, Mendel, oh, this explains everything now. But anyway, so he was doing these experiments with pea plants, basically looking at generation to generation and trying to understand the patterns that were happening. So I think there's a picture in the next, oh, I was wrong. Okay. But so basically he understood through these, because he was looking at, does the color change? What about the stem length? What about the leaf color? Like all these different properties of the plants. What he realized is that there were actually like packages of information that were being passed down. We'd call that a gene now. And he was realizing there were like rules also to like how they were being passed down. Basically, these rules we understand now of whether it's dominant or recessive. So he was the first one to do this. And then some of the terms I've already kind of been using, but you have them here. So genotype, so that is like the genetic information, and that can be represented by, if we're looking at like the karyotype, whether we're looking at, like if someone wrote out your DNA code, if whatever the genetic information is. If we were doing a Punnett square, versus the phenotype is literally like the actual physical trait. So brown eyes, blonde hair, what like the actual physical trait. It's not any more complicated than that, your phenotype, because that's the thing that's interacting with the environment, and then I already said this one before, alleles, alternative form of a gene. Okay, slide 14. Darwin's Idea. Okay, so let me just scroll real quick because I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Let me just look at those. I wonder why I put that there and not. Okay, that's fine. We'll just stick with it. Okay, so slide 14, Darwin's Idea. So like I already kind of said this, but he there were many other thinkers before him who had similar ideas. They didn't quite get it right. They didn't quite understand. Darwin was the first one to really synthesize it in a really great way with multiple examples after years of research on this. And there were a handful of things that are really important to understand about this. He realized resources are finite. Basically what that means is we don't have an unlimited supply of resources. Whatever resource we're talking about, food, water, mates, whatever it is, like we only have so much in any given community, on the earth in general. And there's going to be competition for those resources, whatever those resources are. There's a really good documentary called, I want to say it's called Creation. I could be wrong on that. And it's about Darwin's life, and Paul Bettany plays Charles Darwin. It's really good. In fact, you could watch that for extra credit. It's a really good movie. But it goes into like some of his personal life and his traveling and all that. It's really good. There was a whole point to what I was going to say. Oh yeah, so they go into this in the movie that a lot of the scientists at the time and thinkers thought, nature is at peace and balanced and beautiful, and it's this very overly romanticized view of nature. And Darwin was like, no, nature is horrible sometimes, and there's competition, and there's death, and there's violence, and there is animals are trying to get the food or get another animal for food and to feed their offspring, and like it's a battle, and there is constant competition. Sometimes it's a little more, a little less, depending on the abundance of resources in any given environment. But that competition is always occurring. He also noted this importance of variation, human variation, that for not just human variation, variation in general, for any species, plant or animal, that variation is key. And like if we were in the classroom, I'd say, look around, what's the variation in this classroom? We would clearly see just amongst our species, we'd say some are tall, some are short, some with less body fat, some with more, different color hair, different skin tones, different size feet, different size hands, like any and every trait possible, right? And some of those we might be thinking, well, does that really matter? But given any particular environment, certain traits might be more beneficial or not. And so one of the classic examples is, imagining like a white rabbit in an area with a lot of snow, that animal is going to be able to hide from predators. Then let's say like a black rabbit against snow, like the coloring. So that trait, just the color, is going to be really beneficial. That white rabbit versus like a brown rabbit or a black rabbit is going to be able to survive, more likely to survive, and then produce offspring who also have that same trait. So if you started out with a group of like, let's say it was equally split between white, brown, and black rabbits, probably over in an environment with a lot of snow, probably after a handful of generations, instead of being a third, what you're going to see is going to be the majority are going to be white rabbits. That's basically the idea of natural selection. It can get a little more complicated than that, but that's really like, it's not a complex idea. The way we understand it now, at the time, I think just like I said, people weren't quite clear on like the reproductive part, so it became a little more controversial because of that. And this idea, like I said, this overly romanticized idea of like how nature was. Anyway, okay, so this is Charles Darwin's general idea. And if you ever heard the term Darwinian evolution, now I've heard people use it incorrectly, but Darwinian evolution specifically references natural selection versus the other types of evolution. And we're going to talk about that right now. So slide 15, the forces of evolution. So I already told you, the definition of evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population over time. There is more than one way that can happen. So we're going to talk about these 5 ways. Okay, slide 16. So I already kind of described this to you, natural selection, just building on it a little bit. The idea of a population. So population, it really depends on what you're talking about. Like we could be talking about Las Vegas as a population, or Nevada as a population, or the United States as a population. It's really just depending on the species, not depending on the species, depending on the example you're given. It's really just the potential or actual interbreeding of individuals of the same species. So we get, like, we were in a classroom of like 30 of us, of males and females of the human species. We could say we are a potentially interbreeding population. We're a population. Like I already said, variation, heritability, key thing. Like I said before, these other scientists didn't understand it the way we understand it now, and the way Darwin, I think, was conceptualizing. It's 50% from the female, 50% from the male, and then there's a little more complex than that. But because before they didn't understand, well, I told you before, they thought it was like a blending, but they also, many cultures, even into recent times, thought that, how many of you, I'm asking you like you can answer. I was going to say, how many of you have heard of the idea or thing called a homunculus? So there's some variations of this depending on the culture, but basically it's like this idea that they used to think that females already had like a little people in her, and even when they understood there was a relationship between like sexual intercourse and reproduction, they thought, well, the male, it must spark life into these little things. So but we know now that's not how, it's 50-50. Like, so if you've ever seen like an old, or like a movie where it's like, you know, hundreds of years ago, it's like a period piece, and the woman is somehow being blamed for having a daughter, not a son or something, like, because at the time they thought like, well, she's got the little people in her, it's all her fault. They didn't realize it's actually the male, because female, like the male is the one that, the female, the mother can only give, she only has 2 X chromosomes. She can only give an X, because it's the male who decides whether basically whether it's going to be a male or a female, so it's completely wrong. But it's wrong for multiple reasons. But anyway, okay. So back to the slide. So slide 16, adaptability. So this is given a specific environment, given a specific trait, it can be advantageous or beneficial in some way. And basically the result of this is that change in allele frequency in a population over time. So if you see this picture, you can see that there is a population of bugs. Some are green, some are like an orange color. Their natural predator are these birds. The birds just happen to really like the green ones. Maybe the coloring makes them taste better. So they're like, yum, the green beetle is our favorite. So over generations, they're eating them. So what does that mean? That means obviously like there's going to be fewer in the population just because they're being eaten more, but also that means they're less likely to, if they're dying, maybe they're dying before they're reproducing. So the orange ones have that advantage. So over time, and this is what the picture is showing, is over time what you're going to see is fewer and fewer green ones, and then the orange ones are going to be the majority. So this is natural selection, that their trait just happened to be beneficial in that environment. Now if they were in an environment with another predator, maybe that predator like the orange one's better. This is true for the example with the rabbits. Say it's snowy for generations, but then suddenly the snow melts and it's very, you know, brown and dry for generations. Suddenly the rabbits who are brown, maybe even the ones who are black, are definitely going to have an advantage over the ones who are white. So it's that combination of the trait and the environment together. Okay. Slide 17. Survival of the fittest. This is the kind of the point of this. So you may have heard this term before, and unfortunately, I often hear this term used incorrectly. It does not mean survival of the strongest, because like we use the term fit to mean like You're physically fit. You're strong. That's not what survival of the fittest means. It doesn't mean survival of the strongest, survival of the fastest. That's not what it means. In fact, most of the time, my students, like I'm sure you guys can imagine right now, examples of when being smaller is really advantageous. Being slower is advantageous. So it's not always about being bigger or faster or stronger. It just depends on the environment. Survival of the fittest specifically is in reference to fitness, evolutionary fitness, which basically means, simplified, the number of offspring you have. So it's basically, what this phrase means is it's survival of the people with the most offspring because they are passing down their genetic information the most. So like I have 0 offspring, but if any of you watching have like 1 offspring or 2, you are more fit than I am evolutionarily because I have 0 offspring. Okay. Hopefully that's clear to you guys. And slide 18, just so this is clear, evolution and the process of evolution is not, there is no goal to evolution. We don't have the spirit of natural selection out in the world dictating what happens. That's not how it works. It's just about what traits happen to be available in that population and what the environment looks like and that interaction between those two. Some traits are going to be more advantageous, some won't be. You're going to see that process like over generations, how that those genetics change over time. There is no ultimate goal, because I often hear, I should say often, I've heard before, when are chimps going to evolve into humans? Well, one, chimps will never evolve into humans. Humans already exist. Chimps at some point, like if we don't kill them off, chimps might at some point, over, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe become bipedal, start walking on 2 limbs rather than 4. They might even develop speech. Totally plausible. But they would be their own species. It wouldn't be a human. That's not how it works. And also, there's no goal saying that chimps will one day get bigger brains or begin to talk. Like, that's not a goal. That might happen because it might end up being an advantage for them, but it might not. And also, they might just die. Like, that's just how it works too. There's no goal to evolution. Because we see this all the time, like in looking at life, in the fossil record, that sometimes animals, they start getting bigger and bigger and then suddenly they get smaller again. Or they get faster and then they get slower. Or they develop some kind of, advantage for like eyesight, but then because their environment shifts, then maybe that adaptation becomes lessened and now their adaptation for like, smell is increased or something. So it depends on the environment. There's no goal for any specific thing. Now, there maybe possibly could be the argument that there is a goal of evolution like from less complex to more complex. Maybe that's true. But then it gets into this whole idea of like what is complexity? How do you define complexity? Is there a bias in that? Because like my advisor always says, when we talk about this idea of complexity, he'll say, well, like bats are really complex. Like they have, like echolocation. He's like, we don't have that. Does that mean bats are better? Because that's way more complex. He's like, it just, like, how do you define it? And, it's difficult. And also, this is the other thing I want to point out with this, is there's no goal to, like, don't imagine it that humans are the pinnacle of evolution. Because as we'll see in this class, we have advantages. Sure, just like every species has theirs. We are unique and interesting as a species, just like every species is. There is no goal for things to be human-like or to look like a human. We are not the goal of anything. We happen to be... Now, we, of course, have our own bias because we're humans. Like, if we were squirrels or dogs, we'd be like, squirrels are the best, dogs are the best. But humans, like... Don't get me... Say phrase this the right way. We are, like I said, we are unique and interesting in our own way, but we are by no means... like per this picture, like the top, the best. We are better at some things, that's true, and we are really well adapted to some things, that is also true. But there are plenty of environments where we would be the worst if there was a competition. We're not very fast at all. We don't really have any protective like fur or skin. Now you could say, well, that's because we can make our own clothing, and that's because we don't have to be fast. Because that's absolutely true. This is the point. is that different species are going to adapt in different ways, and we might be better at one thing, but less, another species might be better at something else. It's not a contest in that like, philosophical sense, like what I'm trying to depict with this picture. Like every species is unique and interesting, and at some point, humans, if we don't die, we will evolve into something else, and maybe that'll be more complex, maybe it'll be less complex. There's no ending to it. It's going to keep going. So, just keep that idea in mind. Okay. Slide 19, mutation. So another way that you can see a change in allele frequency in a population over time. So in that process of like mitosis and meiosis and some of the other stuff, when everything's going right, during these processes, DNA is doing what it's supposed to do, like per this. But plenty of times things can go wrong, and in fact, it's very common for you to have a mutation like at the DNA level, the chromosomal level. These things happen. Sometimes they can be neutral, like you just don't notice them. Like if it's on a small little piece of like DNA code, it might not even be something that is ever apparent to you in your behavior or your like phenotype, your like physical appearance. It could be something neutral. It could be something that's advantageous depending on the environment. Like say, oh man, this is like a really old movie. Oh God, what was it? Waterworld? Is that what the movie was called? Kevin Costner, where like there's a giant flood, the world's flooded. Now say that's our environment, and you were born with like a mutation for like webbed feet, you would probably have an advantage. But if you had that mutation now, it's not really going to benefit you. It's probably not going to be a hindrance, in terms of like your likelihood of survival, let's say. It's kind of neutral. So it depends on the environment. And all of us have some kind of mutation to some degree in something. But this is how we get that change in genetic information over time, just because sometimes it just kind of comes from within, that it's just a random process, a mutation process, or mutation of the process. And then also sometimes they can be, detrimental or deleterious. So you might have, if there's like this, if there's a mutation at the chromosomal level and maybe like 2 chromosomes are deleted, that fetus might just not even develop. You might miscarry because it just can't. It's just not viable with life. So it might even be that bad. So that can happen. Slide 20, gene flow. So this is when, and this is what the picture's trying to show, you have, basically, you can have a change in the genetic information in a population simply because some people decide to move out or move in. So say we're looking at Las Vegas, and we took all of Las Vegas, all the humans, and we're like, okay, this is the genetic information. This is what we have right here. Now let's say 20% of Vegas decided to move to California, and then we looked at the genetic information in our population after that move. It would be different, right? Like frequencies, ratios, what levels of different things would be adjusted. It would be different because just randomly, not randomly, but just because certain people decided to leave. If we're looking at that population after that, like before and after, there'd be a change just because some people left. And the same thing is true if people moved in. So say we're looking at Las Vegas genetic, population right now, and let's say 10,000 people from California moved to Las Vegas. We would have a change in the genetic information in our population simply because people decided to move into the population, into our potentially or actually interbreeding population. It has nothing to do with a natural selection process, not a mutation. It's simply because people are moving in and out, and that changes the genetic dynamic of that population. But you still get that. It's still evolution. You get that change in allele frequency or the change in genetic information in that population over time. Slide 21, genetic drift. So this one we say is like kind of due to chance. And a really good example of this is thinking of like island populations are a really good example. So imagine there's an island population, we could say humans still, and let's say just one day a group is down by the beach on the island, and another group is like on a picnic on the hillside. And it just happens to be that mostly blondes are on the beach and mostly redheads are on the hillside. Suddenly there's an earthquake in the ocean and a tsunami comes, and the people on the beach, let's say 95% of them die. The genetic information of that population, of that island population, is going to now be drastically shifted. What could have been before 50% blondes, 50% redheads, is now going to be the majority are going to be redheads because of this natural disaster. So you can see here in this picture, or in this the PowerPoint slide, it says natural disasters or geographic barriers. So also, if imagine for humans it's a little different, but imagine there's like a species of like frogs, and over time there's like a river forming, or like a mountain range, and that population might get separated or isolated. This is another example of genetic drift, that the population density or population frequency might change. Oh my god, the genetic frequency might change just because of something like that. But you end up getting that change in that frequency over time. Okay, and the last one, non-random mating, otherwise known as, sorry, my scroller's being weird. Okay, non-random mating, otherwise known as sexual selection. So if you're with me in the 102 class, we spend a lot of time talking about this. And we're going to spend time talking about it in this class too, because culturally, this is when it gets really interesting. But in the other class, biologically, it's also really interesting too. Okay, so here, basically what this means is who you are attracted to, whether you're a human or a frog or a dog, doesn't matter. It's not random why you are attracted to who you're attracted to. So if I were to ask everyone, give me a list of the 10 traits that is like your ideal person, it would very likely be a combination of like some physical traits, some, emotional traits, maybe some hobbies or activities you hope that they also enjoy the way you do. You could say like, oh, I want someone who's tall, I prefer blonde hair, I like this type of build. Or if you're a heterosexual male, you might say, well, I like, a woman who's a little curvier. I like tall women or whatever. You might say, I want them to be a good communicator, or I really want them to be involved in sports because I like sports. Like, you'd have a list. Like, everyone would have a list, and our list would be very different. Our preferences would be different. But there are very specific reasons why we have those preferences. This is the point, it's not random. Now, as a species, there might be certain trends that are probably generally true for most, like we could say, like most heterosexual females would probably opt for this trait over this trait, or most heterosexual males would opt for this one trait over this trait, because we understand like the evolutionary adaptive process of mate selection. But your own personal history will also inform on that too. Maybe you had a really bad experience as a child with like a male with red hair, and as an adult you're like, I don't date anyone with red hair. Like, that can be a thing for sure. So it's partly evolution, it's partly your personal history, but evolutionarily this is kind of what we're getting at. So I have a couple of examples of this. So go to slide 23, and you also see on slide 24, kind of go back and forth between those two. You'll see that it's almost the same picture, but there's something a little different. So look at slide 23. There are 3 women. Now, typically in class, I would say, okay, for the heterosexual males mostly, but pretty much anyone can participate. And of course, if you're just watching this alone, obviously you can participate. So if you look at those 3 females, you might notice that pretty much she looks the same in each one, but there's one key difference. And if we were in class, it'd be like, take a minute, think about it, but I'll just tell you. The main difference in these pictures is her waist size. Now look at slide 24, it's similar. Now for these 3 women, she's a little curvier, but if you look at 1, 2, and 3 across, it's the same feature. It's the waist size. And the point of this is something called waist to hip ratio. And this has been studied like multiple times across cultures, that for heterosexual males, it doesn't matter if the woman is, a size 4, like in slide 23, or in slide 24, maybe she's a size like 14. That the attractive trait isn't necessarily like her general size. It's, is there a distinct waistline? Is there a distinct waistline between, or is there just, oh my God, is there a distinct difference between the waist and the hips? Like I said, the waist to hip ratio. What we see is that, most of the time heterosexual males for both of these photos will pick the first female, whether it's size 23 or 24. It doesn't matter if she's, like I said, size 4 or size 14, if there is a defined waist. And this is because of a few things. The defined waist and the extension and the larger, like more rounded hips. Now this is the thing, is no heterosexual male most likely is thinking this at the forefront of his mind. And this is the point of it being, it's non-random, it's an evolutionary process. That what this ends up meaning is that, well, one, she's gone through puberty, so she's ready to have offspring because she has gone through this process. Now she has extra fat in certain areas of her body. Her pelvis is a little wider for childbirth. She has extra fat on her hips, which is vital to having any offspring, that you need extra, which is why females tend to have more body fat. This is designed by natural selection. So when you get pregnant, or if you get pregnant, you can gestate the fetus, and you have a natural reserve of body fat to make sure that there's enough for that very long process. Which is why, to kind of get not really on a sidetrack, but some of you might be familiar, especially the females, like once you get your period, age 12 or something, 13, maybe younger. If at any point after that you drastically lose a lot of weight, if you're like if you're really into athletics, or you're a dancer and your body fat drops really low, it's very common to stop getting your period. And this is part of that process. Like your body's like, whoa, it's called amenorrhea. Your body's like, whoa, there's definitely not enough fat to barely feed you, let alone any potential fetus. We'll be gestating for 9 months. Let's just stop this process. And when the body fat increases, the process will start back up. Okay, so we got the wider hips, the extra body fat, which is what, like, I see so many females like, oh, my hips, my legs, like, I know this is per this class, it's a very cultural thing, that we have this standard of beauty, but it is absolutely natural for that to be there, for you to have extra fat on your thighs, on your hips, on your lower belly. Like, so many women, like, I feel like they have this idea of like, it has to be super flat. It's like, yeah, you could get it to that point, but naturally it should be this way. You should be curvy naturally. Whether it's a little bit or a lot, having curves and having having the body fat there is part of the natural process. Okay, but back to this. So some heterosexual males might not be thinking that at the forefront of their mind, like, oh yeah, those child-bearing hips. Like maybe they do, but most of the time they're not. They're thinking, I like curvy women, or I want to touch those hips. They're not really thinking about the evolutionary or reproductive implications of that. But also the smaller waist, because you might be thinking, well, big hips, sure, but all of those women have like wider hips. Why is it the waist? Because having the right fat distribution is also indicative of how healthy you are. So if you have a lot of like abdominal fat, that usually indicates it's not healthy, versus having like lower, like, like I said, around your hips and lower waist, that's definitely indicative of being healthy. So it's this interesting combination of definitely ready to have children and also healthy. She's a viable, mate choice. Okay, slide 25. This is another example. So everyone obviously can participate. But for the heterosexual females, take a second and look at these photos. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Which one do you think is the most attractive? I would say probably 4. And I'm like in the norm, because just like with the other study, the study's been done cross-culturally multiple times. And for most women, they pick number 3 and number 4. And there are a few reasons for this. So if you're looking at these photos, I'll just tell you, like in class, I wish we were in class for some of these, because then I can hear your guys' answers. But basically it's the same person. The only difference is the facial hair. So he's the same age, but doesn't he look significantly younger in the first one to the number 5, number 1 to number 5, just that facial hair. So already he looks older. And for imagining in terms of like our evolutionary history and past, what would have been an attractive trait for males or attractive trait for females. For females, we might be considering, I want a mate who has a little more knowledge and experience in multiple things, like in life in general, in gathering food, in building structures, in navigating terrain. That I want someone who's a partner with me who has the knowledge base, and that typically comes with age. So wanting someone a little older makes total sense. But then you might be thinking, okay, but why not pick the very last one all the time? Why is it only 3 or 4? Why is it that middle range? And this is because hair growth is tied to the amount of testosterone. And what we know about a lot of more recent studies, but we've known for a while, is that testosterone, especially when it's really high, can often affect behavior. So when you have really high testosterone, like this individual number 5 does, they probably will very likely have more aggressive behavior. That's definitely a thing that we see a correlation with. So for a female, she might want to find that balance of someone who's knowledgeable, experienced, not aggressive, but protective, not too aggressive with her, finding that middle balance. Just like with the male, finding someone who, definitely can, is healthy and a good potential mate to be the mother of his offspring. Now, most of us, like for females, for example, when we see a guy with a beard or without a beard or whatever your preference is, you're probably not thinking, oh yeah, testosterone, you know. You probably just think, I like that or I don't like that. I mean, that's the point. Is most of this isn't like at the forefront of our minds. It's just, but it's happening. So it's not random. And just the last two examples. So slide 26. So this is Scarlett Johansson. You're probably thinking it looks like her, but it doesn't. This is because they've taken her left side of her face and her right side of her face and mirrored it, so you see symmetrical. Everyone's face is slightly asymmetrical. This is normal, but the more asymmetrical, the less attractive that person is typically considered. And so there have been a lot of studies on this. The more symmetrical the face, the more attractive someone is. And what we know now is that facial symmetry actually is directly linked to overall health. So while we may not think that, or we may not know that when we're looking at someone, it's like an evolutionary, psychological advantage. Like we recognize somewhere that that person maybe is not as healthy. And in terms of like picking a mate to have offspring with, that's going to be important. And then the last one, slide 27. So there's actually this interesting study done where males were given a series of photos like this of the same woman. She looked fairly similar in both photos. Like I think for all of them they had like no makeup on, hair was styled the same way, similar clothing, but it was a picture of her taken on 2 different days. And for all of these series of photos, the heterosexual men were asked, pick the photo that you find her to be the most attractive in. And like I said, it wasn't as if in one photo she's like all, makeup and another one she's not. It was like the same, like this example, fairly as close to the same as possible. What the men didn't realize was that in one photo she was ovulating and in another photo she was not. How would he have known that, right? And how would he have sensed that from a photo? But what they found out was that actually, overwhelmingly, statistically significantly, heterosexual males would pick the photo of the female who was ovulating. And there's been a lot of studies on this, like looking at it, like, do we have pheromones? How can we tell? There have been multiple studies like women's like sexual arousal levels when she's ovulating versus when she's not, and men obviously can sense something. And there's been the idea is like maybe there's something about the glow of the skin or the eyes. Look, we don't know. There's still research going into this, but just know, like, whenever you're attracted to someone, there's probably like a million things going on in the back of your head, like that's an evolutionary adaptation from like hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years that you're not even really thinking about, but you're just like, I like that or I don't. Okay. The forces of evolution. Okay, that's it, and I will see you guys on the next lecture.